thank you, because on another part of that, my chapter actually looks at essentially, I think in any country, I think firstly, there were people probably in the Middle East who saw Germany potentially be the answer to sort of against British and French imperialism, and therefore, to some extent, actually, that would be the side to take. You're absolutely right. Now, I've not mentioned the sort of that meeting with the Mufti in November 41 in Berlin, and you're absolutely right about the divisions. I think in every country, it is a mixture of both. There were undeniably people who were only too happy to join, Muslim people were happy to join sort of, as you say, those divisions of the Waffen SS. David Motterdell has recently written about this sort of Islam and Nazi Germany. But I think within every nation as well, there were also people who saw that Nazism in itself was anathema to Islam, and that actually it was purely a kind of a political gain. So I think possibly someone like Abdul Majid, you could argue that he felt a sense of political pressure, given his position in Woking, given his position in Britain, that he needs to be seen as outwardly supportive. But I do genuinely believe that there is a sense of sincerity there. If you look within wider sort of Middle East, so again, I've mentioned about Algeria, and I've mentioned, that Raphael de Solla's perception of Muslims being far more friendly than the Christians. But I could also tell you of there are many examples of attacks against Jewish communities that did take place, and atrocities there. So it is a tremendously kind of mixed picture. I don't necessarily think, though, that Abdul Majid is simply an outlier. And I think you also have to tie that into potentially the kind of the whole empire picture, the fact that, obviously empire troops are mobilized to fight against Nazi Germany. So I think that plays a bearing. But in every country, there are some elements of what you described and other elements against it. And certainly after Mussolini, because I know you mentioned about Mussolini before, after the Italian incursions into Albania, many Muslims there absolutely rejected the idea that Mussolini was the protector of Islam. And we have, the 200 or 300 Albanian Jews were largely protected during the Holocaust by their Muslim neighbors through that principle of Besa, this idea of, common humanity. So I know it's not the greatest answer, but it's a mixed picture. What we begin to see after 1945 is, and it really starts in America, is within public discourse, we start hearing this idea of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, in many ways, before, let's say, 1939, it would have probably made more sense to talk of a Judeo-Islamic tradition, because, in many ways, if you look at the history of Jewish-Christian relations versus Jewish-Muslim relations, there are peaks and troughs. And again, we could go all day about, how much better was life under Islam than under Christianity, and it varies from time to place. We won't go into that. But I think what happened after 1945 is that as the discourse of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which I think was a post-Holocaust way of trying to rationalize and come to terms. And obviously, we then see the shifts within, within Christian Jewish. So by 1965, we've got the famous statement where essentially Jews are no longer held collectively responsible. What I then think happened is that as the demographics shifted in Europe, for whatever reason, there was this emphasis that Jews and Christians who have been sort of, although Jews have not been treated necessarily well, and we've often seen you as the other, but we've been here, Europe is ours, this is our domain. And now the demographics are changing and Muslim communities in Europe are growing and growing. And by the mid-1970s, there are liberal rabbis in Britain like Lionel Blue who are saying, no one's talking about it, but actually the big thing we should now be focusing on, as well as, of course, the importance of Jewish-Christian, is Muslim relations. They are growing populations, and basically most Jews, and this is a real shift, but he claimed by the 70s, probably don't know that much about Islam, that basically they know very little more than you could write on a finger. So I think that post-45 attempts to create that Judeo-Christian, the notion of a Judeo-Christian notion, are partly to do with that. And I also agree with what you said, that obviously both communities are tremendously, as you say, they're not homogenous, they completely vary. And as time has gone on, you know, particularly I think in the 1980s, if you look in Britain at the sort of different demographics of the Jewish and Muslim community. So in the 30s, it was 340,000 Jews, approximately 20,000 Muslims. If you look by the 90s, you know, there'll be 1.5 million Muslims. And now, you know, I don't know if we'll look forward to seeing the census figures. And I think that's had a real bearing on that as well. So I think those demographic shifts and perhaps perceptions as well, you know, that essentially the British Jewish community is seen as perhaps more established, more integrated, has more organizations like the Board of Deputies, whereas in a sense, sort of Muslim communities have been sort of learning in one sense from the Jewish community, but also feeling a sense of catch-up. So I think it's post-war, there's a big change. I'm sorry, I'm rambling on. Thank you, Harry. Very nice to meet you. I'm going to speak, if you don't mind, just in terms of my role now. So I work as a lecturer in history education at Manchester Metropolitan, and I work with quite a lot of sort of trainee history teachers. And we've just had a few sessions looking at sort of sensitive approaches to teaching the Holocaust. And I think one of the profound things that upsets me and worries me, and something that I feel I want to try, is that if you have communities who've never interacted with each other on the ground. So I had a student a couple of weeks ago who said to me, we're doing a really good network about, series of lessons about the Holocaust. We're really trying to humanize the pre-war Jewish life. But she said some of the children, they've never met a Jew. And from what they see in the media, they find it hard to regard Jews as fully perhaps human or as tangible as they might be. And she said that this is a real problem because that tempers empathy. So it is my hope that kind of focusing on this, a lot of my research, I think you've also mentioned, I know tonight I haven't spoken so much about the Mufti, I have not spoken about the Farhud. There are other things I could say, and they are in my work. But I'm trying to sort of keep it all in perspective. And I think what I would say going forward is I wish that there was a way, because forums like this are magnificent, and we, you know, some of the work and the contacts made are great. My challenge now as someone involved in education is how we can foster those smaller local links, and I think pretty much for one to see the humanity in the other, and to sort of say, actually, you know what? Yeah, we have commonalities, we have a shared history in certain ways, and we have a lot. And I think some of the kind of polarization of our society doesn't help with that. And something I'm very strongly grappling with are things, you know, on a local level, things that can be done. I've just been invited back into a school in January, and again, I went to visit a school, and I wear my kippah, my skull cap, and I was sat at the back of a room observing a student in a history lesson, and outside in the corridor, a child shouted, Jew, Jew, free Palestine, and had seen my kippah. And I think the person I was sat with was extremely embarrassed. I didn't say anything at times. I didn't want to disrupt or let the student find out. And afterwards I said, you know what, this is actually a real education opportunity. I would love to sit down and actually open a conversation, because that comment comes from, this particular child had probably never seen anyone identifyingly Jewish before. And I see that as an education opportunity. So to me, it's how do we put all of this onto a local, tangible level? And I know it's, you know, I'm not going to be idealistic and unrealistic, but I think, you know, that to me is the profound way of how we can get that grassroots contact. But thank you. I think what had happened there, I think, because it was referring to what Dr. Abdullah had said when he moved from Berlin to Wagi. I think that process of having to try and accommodate to the Nazi regime in whatever way, shape or form, these are tropes that were very, very commonly, you know, this idea of the stab in the back myth, that not just Jews, but communists and others had betrayed Germany. And we know the fact that, you know, 12,000 Jews died fighting for Germany in the First World War, and 100,000, you know, Jewish German men fought, absolutely undisputable. But throughout the First World War, there were accusations of Jews disproportionately in Germany benefiting from the black market of goods, that Jews were war war profiteering, all these sorts of things. And, you know, the stab in the back myth was born long before Hitler came to power. You know, if you look at images from 1918, and it's my opinion, probably what had happened living in Nazi Germany for 5 years and having to have that process of accommodation with the Nazi regime to keep their own institute going. I think you probably you begin to internalize possibly some of those tropes that you hear. I mean, he qualified it by saying, of course, it doesn't justify the horrendous wave of anti-Semitism we're saying, but I think this was commonly believed. Now, and just one other example to illustrate it, one of the so after the war, when Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, one of the political assassinations was deliberately targeting Walter Rathenau, who was Jewish. And certainly that lent to credence of, you know, here we go again. Now the Jews are stabbing us in the back again with the peace treaty. So, yeah, I think, again, it's as you say, it goes back a lot way, but it is entirely false. Fascinating. So firstly, just kind of going back to what you were saying about the militants, I think you're certainly onto some interesting truth there, because certainly Jews under the militants, they had very much autonomy. You know, the position of the chief rabbi had a tremendous amount of autonomy. And I think even within the Ottoman Empire, I would say, you know, there was a spectrum of observance. There's certainly, and by the time we get to 1909 with the Young Turk Revolution, you know, some of the people involved now are more potential secular leaning Jews. I think today we are certainly in a polarized age. You're absolutely right. So there are some segments within the strictly Orthodox community who are anti-Zionist or skeptical of Zion, but not all. I mean, Chabad, it's interesting you mentioned Chabad, because, you know, many people in Chabad, although the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself was not necessarily Zionist in the traditional way, certainly I think he took a hard line on the question of the potential of land for peace. So I think you're right, we have a polarized community, but I still think that there is, even amongst perhaps more sort of culturally Jews who would perhaps define themselves in more cultural or, you know, slightly less traditional terms, I still think that there is that potential for synthesis with many British Muslims, and again, there's a wide spectrum, you know, within the British Muslim community. So I think there is still that potential, but I understand what you're saying in terms of that sort of glue that may have bound things a little in the past as now sort of splitting a bit. But I think that's really a really interesting theory to discuss further. Thank you.